At this juncture, I'd like to draw your attention to a relatively minor thing that I brought up during the first intermission in this series, while I was making a point about how crowded the video game market was in the late 80s and early 90s, at the peak of Nintendo's cultural relevance and dominance over video gaming. This is the Viewmaster Interactive Vision, a strange and misbegotten video game console based on VHS technology that leapt into the fray in the middle of 1989 and was dragged back out, battered and unconscious, less than a year later, with only a handful of licensed educational titles to its credit. It was one of the most forgettable consoles in video game history, which is at least a little surprising, because the company that created it was a fairly successful one, with a core product that achieved icon status with several generations of American children. The eponymous Viewmaster, which worked with interchangeable reels to display a variety of pseudo-3D images to the user. The Viewmaster was a kind of stereoscope, literally a solid picture, which simulates 3D by having you look at two images close up at the same time. It works because in actual three-dimensional reality, each of your eyes records a slightly different two-dimensional image, and when these images are sent to your brain, it combines the information from both to create a sense of depth. That's why, if you put a hand in front of your right eye while keeping both eyes open, the hand appears to be transparent. This is essentially your brain trying to make sense of conflicting information. The right eye is telling you that all you can see is your hand, while the left one can still see what's behind it. Stereoscopic 3D as a form of entertainment is much older than the Viewmaster. Heck, one of the most successful stereoscope models was invented way back in 1861 by the poet and philosopher Oliver Wendell Holmes. But when it was introduced in 1939, the Viewmaster benefited from a surge of interest in travel and world culture among a large group of consumers who didn't have the money to actually travel the world and see its cultures in person. With the Viewmaster and its endless variety of photo reels, you could sit in your easy chair and imagine you were almost anywhere in the world, or even in an animated fantasy land if you wanted to, since there was no requirement that the stereoscopic images had to be real photographs. Drawings worked just as well. But if static 3D images were popular enough to create a whole industry that went strong for centuries, it stands to reason that moving 3D images should be an even bigger sensation. And the technology for doing so is simple. A film, after all, is just a series of still images projected one after the other so quickly that the brain sees them as continuous. So if you set up two cameras, approximately where a person's left and right eyes would be, have them film the same scene, and then project it on two screens with the audience watching them through a stereoscope, bam! The movie will seem like it's happening right in front of them. Since stereoscopy was invented before motion pictures, 3D movies are in fact just about as old as cinema itself. But they were rarely more than an occasional gimmick that would stick around for a few years and then disappear until the rise of a new generation of novelty-seeking moviegoers. Unfortunately, while the theory behind making them was simple, the actual process of making 3D movies turned out to be difficult and expensive. And what's worse, the end product wasn't much more engaging than 2D. Movies were already an overwhelming sensory experience. Giant room-filling sets, props, and human faces bathed in the glaring light of the projector, accompanied by the boom of synchronized music and voices. If you were enjoying a movie, there was already a tendency to get swept away and not realize you were looking at a flat picture. The extra depth provided by 3D was unnecessary, and might even spoil the illusion. Another problem with 3D movies was that being fed twice the usual amount of visual information was something many viewers couldn't physically handle. The rapid-fire stereoscopic images would make them nauseous and headachy, and if by some accident the two sets of images got desynced, so that each eye was seeing a noticeably different picture, that made almost everyone want to barf. The upsides of the system were just too small, and the potential downsides too dangerous, for any major studio to treat 3D as the future of cinema. It tended to be used in movies that had low budgets to begin with, like horror and exploitation movies, so that filming everything twice wouldn't cost too much, and if it ended up flopping, so what? You just moved on to the next experiment. Inevitably, the format became associated with cheesy scripts, overblown visual effects, and huckster movie promoters trying to make a quick, easy buck. However, where 3D really flew highest and scraped lowest was not with pictures or movies, but with video games. Now oddly, Viewmaster didn't try to make a 3D video game console or peripheral, even though their whole identity revolved around stereoscopic images. Nintendo, on the other hand, did make one, more than a year before the announcement of the Viewmaster Interactive Vision. This was the Famicom 3D system, consisting of an adapter which plugged into a pair of shutter glasses for the user to wear. The 3D effect worked by only displaying an image in one eyepiece at a time, and shifting between them so quickly that the shift was unnoticeable. This mechanical approach produces a more realistic picture than the common anaglyph method, in which the images are split up using two different colors of light. But it's also more expensive and kind of clunky, in addition to making the image look dimmer, because less light reaches each eye. This was bleeding-edge technology in 1987, and as you might expect, Nintendo bled for it. Only a handful of games used the Famicom 3D system, the most famous of which is probably Rad Racer, a hit racing game from Squaresoft that managed to outsell Final Fantasy. But the 3D was a very small part of its success. Plus, it was later converted to work with plain old anaglyph glasses anyway. The peripheral completely flopped and was never released outside Japan, and for the next several years, Nintendo forgot that 3D even existed. Until, in 1991, Nintendo received a visit from a guy named Steve Lipsey, who represented a Massachusetts company called Reflection Technologies Incorporated, or RTI for short. Their main product was a personal, head-mounted optical display called the Private Eye. The elevator pitch for this device was that it would take the place of a computer screen, allowing images to be beamed directly into your retinas without using as much power as a laptop display, or revealing the contents of the screen to others. Alan Becker, the founder of RTI, originally created the Private Eye as a computer accessory, but Lipsey had already made several presentations of it as a toy to companies like Mattel, Hasbro, and even Sega. But because the Private Eye could only display one color, red on a black background, on top of the fact that 3D headsets were known to cause eye strain and nausea, all of these prospective buyers had turned it down. Lipsey probably thought he was headed for another rejection when Hiroshi Yamauchi, the president of Nintendo, actually fell asleep in his chair near the end of his presentation. But despite this bad omen, Gunpei Yokoi, the head of Nintendo's oldest R&D division, was apparently ecstatic about the device. He had just a few years before developed the Game Boy, possibly the most innovative product Nintendo would ever release, and its success was owed to the fact that it used simple microchips, which most companies would have considered obsolete, in an innovative way, what he sometimes referred to as lateral thinking with withered technology. Yokoi wasn't a fan of how the 16-bit console generation had touched off a developmental arms race between Nintendo and Sega. More than anyone else at Nintendo, he felt that games shouldn't have to be flashy or full of spectacle to sell. They didn't have to look or play like arcade games, they just had to be fun. And since Yokoi was a former toy maker, his idea of fun centered on the use of unique hardware. Emphasis on unique, which doesn't necessarily mean new. Thus, precisely because this was the kind of thing that Mattel and Sega didn't want, Yokoi saw potential in it. And so Nintendo licensed the Private Eye technology from RTI, took a minority investment stake in the company, and started work on a third console platform that would stand apart from its existing successes, the Super Nintendo and the Game Boy. It wouldn't be a home console, strictly speaking, because it wasn't expected to keep up with the cutting edge of 16-bit graphics. How could it with a monochrome display? But it also wasn't exactly portable. I mean, you could move it around, but to play with it you had to sit still with the console resting on a table, so it was nowhere near as convenient or simple to use as the Game Boy. And while its games were designed to feature interesting pseudo-3D effects, the gameplay would remain firmly in the 2D mold familiar to Nintendo's fans, unlike the upcoming and very hyped N64. There's no getting around it. The Virtual Boy, as it would eventually be known, was just a terrible concept that seemed as if it was designed to avoid lucrative target markets rather than to attract a specific one. It was almost as expensive as the Super Nintendo had been 5 years before, and more expensive than buying a Super Nintendo in 1995, even with a game bundled in. But its graphics looked uglier than the Super Nintendo's, and it didn't have anything like that console's stellar library of games. Customers who wanted the Nintendo Lite experience would just buy a Game Boy for a third of the price, and probably have more fun to boot. But worst of all, even though the Virtual Boy's gimmick didn't count as proper virtual reality because you weren't able to move your head while playing, users still complained of eye strain, nausea, and headaches, which were only exacerbated by the bright red light of the display and the necessity of squishing your face right up against it to play. The fact that the Virtual Boy still sold more than 750,000 units is a testament to the strength of Nintendo's brand in 1995. There were a lot of people who trusted them to come out with a good product, even if it looked weird and clunky on paper. But it was still an obvious flop that didn't come close to earning what it had cost to develop in the first place. It humiliated Gunpei Yokoi, although it didn't technically cost him his job, as some have suggested, propelled Nintendo into being even more of a software-driven company, ensuring that Shigeru Miyamoto, the head of Nintendo's only 100% software division, would soon become top dog around the office, and further cemented the idea that Nintendo and stereoscopic 3D just didn't mix. The first time around, Nintendo toyed with the idea of a 3D peripheral, got burned, and walked away. The second time, they sank 4 years of development and tens of millions of dollars into a full-on 3D console, which they absolutely did not need, lost their shirts on the deal, and sprinted away. In order for them to even consider touching this technology again, they would have to be really desperate. Or so you would think. The truth is that, despite its financial non-viability, Nintendo couldn't stop itself from experimenting with 3D technology. Gunpei Yokoi wasn't the only one who fell under its spell. Satoru Iwata and Shigeru Miyamoto were fascinated by it too. And so, even long after Yokoi had left Nintendo, the desire to do something with 3D visuals persisted. On both the GameCube and the Game Boy Advance SP, Nintendo experimented with special LCD screens that would display games in stereoscopic 3D. Luigi's Mansion was even produced in a 3D format as a proof of concept. And here I thought that game was wildly experimental already. As a company that was always looking for the next exciting innovation that would change video games in some way other than higher resolutions and faster frame rates, Nintendo kept looking wistfully over at 3D and thinking, this works, we just don't know exactly how. In their typical stubborn fashion, the top brass was certain that the Virtual Boy wasn't a bad product, just one that had been misunderstood, kind of like Metroid Other M. But one thing which they had definitely decided on by the late 2000s was that any 3D console from them had to work without a headset to be a success. The biggest obstacle to consumer interest in the Virtual Boy had been how uncomfortable and restrictive it was to use. Get rid of that clunkiness, and you were left with a graphical gimmick that was just as easy to appreciate as any ordinary game. The late 2000s was an ideal time to pursue this dream. LCDs had gotten a lot better and a lot cheaper over the past decade. Also, while there were a lot of programming hurdles to get over in terms of rendering two virtual worlds at the same time, one for each eye, the technique for showing it to the player without glasses was surprisingly simple. It just required a bit of a paradigm shift. 3D with glasses works because the colored lenses or shifting shutters prevent each eye from seeing a certain type or source of light, forcing it to see only what it would see if the image was three-dimensional. But if you want the eye to only see what it should, you don't have to block the image off where the eye is. You can do it where the image is, by producing it in such a way that it can only be seen at one particular angle, the same principle used to print holograms. Nintendo's 3DS used what's called a parallax barrier, basically just a screen with slits cut at precise intervals to allow only one set of pixels to reach each eye. Now this only works if you view it from the right angle. Like holograms, if you move your head a few inches left or right, the effect disappears, and you end up with double vision, not the illusion of 3D. But this isn't a huge problem, because people naturally tend to keep their heads in one place while playing a handheld game. The Virtual Boy's fatal flaw wasn't that it could only be seen from one angle, it was that you had to set the thing up on a table and smoosh your head into it. The 3DS always gives you the option of looking away from the screen for a moment, and in fact, the bottom screen isn't in 3D, so every time you look at that, your eyes get a rest. Playing the Virtual Boy was more like that scene from A Clockwork Orange, where they put Alex in a straitjacket and force his eyes open with clamps. Not only was it an uncomfortable posture for gaming, but to look away you had to push your chair back and make a conscious decision to stop playing. On the other hand, the Virtual Boy had been a relatively small investment compared with the upcoming N64, which was crucial to Nintendo's future in a way that the Virtual Boy was definitely not. The 3DS was a different story, because it was to be the successor to the Nintendo DS and heir to an entire massive branch of Nintendo's business. The DS at that time was, and technically still is, the best-selling Nintendo product of any kind. Seen as bizarre when it was originally unveiled, it had won the hearts of more than 100 million customers and convinced the world that two screens were just as fun as one. These were big shoes to fill for the 3DS, and stereoscopic 3D wasn't the only radical leap that Nintendo was proposing for it. There was going to be a whole ecosystem of interconnected tech on this thing. Social interaction apps, augmented reality experiences, a much more fleshed out and accessible online shop, and Nintendo games in 3D, all on a smartphone-sized device that you could take with you anywhere. The only problem was that Nintendo's customers weren't buying it. Literally. Because it had been designed with all kinds of new technology, the 3DS was almost as expensive as a new home console, notably unlike the cheap and accessible DS. At the same time, the device was on the small side, which would normally be a selling point for a portable system, but a small screen is not an ideal showcase for 3D visual effects. The cramped control layout also made users' hands hurt after a long play session, and this, combined with the now familiar reports of eye strain from looking at stereoscopic images, made its central gimmick sound even worse as a selling point. But the worst thing about the device was something it shared 100% in common with the ill-fated Virtual Boy. It didn't have any games. Obviously, that's not literally true in either case, but the 3DS clearly suffered early on from a lack of quality software. If you look at its launch lineup, only 2 games were actually made by Nintendo: Pilot Wings Resort and Nintendogs and Cats. The first one is a 4th-string Nintendo franchise that's nevertheless been used as a launch title twice. This time, it didn't work out. And the second is a surprisingly lucrative series, despite its general irrelevance to Nintendo's brand identity. But the point is that it's not a system seller. On the other hand, the 3DS began its first 6 months with no Mario games, no Zelda games, no Fire Emblem, no Kirby, no Animal Crossing, no Pokémon. Nintendo was more or less relying on the inherent appeal of 3D as a concept to sell customers on the console, and it wasn't working. Sales in the first 3 months after launch were so disappointing that Nintendo slashed the price from $249 to $169, which was a bit of a slap in the face to superfans who had bought it right away. To make things right, they did probably the coolest thing that Nintendo's ever done when they technically didn't have to: the Ambassador program, through which early adopters of the 3DS would be given 20 classic games through the Virtual Console, most of which weren't available otherwise. But this was just a stopgap. What the 3DS needed to save its life was killer apps from Nintendo's biggest franchises as soon as humanly possible. Ports of the N64 classics Star Fox 64 and Ocarina of Time helped, and a new 2D Mario game was due in about a year. But Nintendo's real ace in the hole to save the struggling 3DS was its new 3D Mario outing, the first to debut on the portable market rather than home consoles: Super Mario 3D Land. Of course, one of the weird things about Super Mario 3D Land is that, despite being the most hyped up thing about it, the 3D element is mostly irrelevant to how it plays. Don't get me wrong, it is a unique visual experience. It feels kind of like looking into one of those shoebox dioramas kids make in school, except with a little Italian guy bouncing around it, stomping all the painted cardboard and cotton balls into a colorful dust cloud. But there's nothing essential about it. I've played through almost the entire game with the 3D turned off, and the experience is remarkably similar. I firmly believe that Super Mario 3D Land's greatest asset isn't how visually enticing it is, but how fast it is. This was the first Mario game in more than 2 decades to be comfortable with the idea of super short levels, like clearable in under a minute short. And this approach to design gives it a stronger sense of nostalgia for the classic 2D platformers than any amount of retro aesthetics. When I'm playing Super Mario 3D Land, I feel the same kind of tooth-grinding exhilaration induced by Super Mario Bros. 3, where you die to the same thing 10 times, but you're still just as intent on pushing through and beating the level as you were to start with. In fact, even with the addition of an entire extra dimension to its level design, Super Mario 3D Land seems to take more ideas from Super Mario Bros. 3 than any other Mario game. The most useful power-up in both games is the Super Leaf, with its trademark abilities of tail swiping and gliding, now also seen in Tanuki-style enemies with their own raccoon tails. Airships are back as a world-ending level type, along with classic airship enemies like Boom Boom and the Rocky Wrenches. Enemies disguised as blocks are back. So are note blocks that shoot you up to a coin heaven. And new enemy types include obvious takeoffs on Thwomps and Boos, the 2 most important new enemies that debuted in Super Mario Bros. 3. But Super Mario 3D Land is nothing if not eclectic. While it includes all these things either taken or adapted from a single previous game, it also picks and chooses a variety of elements from other games in the series to round out its design. The snake platforms from Super Mario World, for instance, which appeared virtually unchanged in Super Mario Galaxy 2, are here reimagined as flip panels, which unfold one bit at a time to build a path in front of you that collapses with shocking speed once it's complete. The bouncy mushroom platforms from New Super Mario Bros. Return, but here their use is much more restricted. Now they're a tool for overcoming specific platforming challenges, not just a quirky alternative way to get through the stage. In general, there's a sense that elements are included in a level only when they're strictly necessary to make the basic concept work, not just because they would be cool to see. Koichi Hayashida, in describing how Super Mario 3D Land compares to earlier 3D Mario games, referred to Super Mario Galaxy 2 as an enormous feast, meant to overwhelm the player with all kinds of tempting diversions. Super Mario 3D Land, by contrast, was more like a little snack. A hamburger, for instance, which should be tasty, but also simple and easy to wolf down without any regrets. As far as the team was concerned, 2D Mario had always had this kind of fast food appeal, which was probably why those games traditionally sold better. The stages in something like New Super Mario Bros. Are mostly self-contained, so if you only beat 3 or 4 of them in a sitting and get called away, at least you were able to enjoy those stages to the fullest. Now take something like Super Mario Sunshine. I would argue that this is a lot more fun than New Super Mario Bros., but if you were to only do half the missions in, say, Noki Bay, leaving the water polluted and the area's story unfinished, there's this impression of being torn away before your work was done. And this is not to mention the fact that doing half of Noki Bay also takes more time than doing 4 stages in a 2D Mario game. Sunshine is emotionally rewarding only if you invest a lot in it, while the 2D Mario games give you a guaranteed good time, regardless of your level of emotional investment. Satoru Iwata described the overall approach of Super Mario 3D Land as an attempt to nudge fans of 2D Mario into giving the 3D style a chance, by making a 3D game that followed the logic of 2D. You can clearly see this in the game's level design, which despite being 3D, often heavily railroads you into moving in one direction, with a structure that sometimes verges on a 2.5D style, like that of Kirby 64 or the Klonoa games. You might think that I, as an admitted fanboy of Sunshine and Galaxy, would be disappointed at this retreat from the possibilities of full 3D. But actually, I really enjoy the way Super Mario 3D Land is designed, in large part because it doesn't overpromise. You're shown a world that's kind of 3D, and that's how it stays through the whole game. If you consider freedom of movement as a kind of bandwidth, with a wider band representing the exploratory approach of games like Super Mario 64, and a narrower one indicating something more linear, then Super Mario Galaxy 2 would appear as a band that's usually fairly wide, but often gets crimped down. These bottlenecks represent areas which are entirely in 2D, or in some other way make the way forward obvious. Super Mario 3D Land is narrower overall, but the fluctuations between freedom and linearity are much smaller. You almost always have some choice about how you get through a level, just not much, so the level design overall feels more consistent and fair, if that makes sense. More than anything else, what Super Mario 3D Land represents to me is the abandonment of a pretense that Mario had been clinging to ever since the series went 3D. The idea that each new mainline Mario game represented a radical innovation on what had gone before. This idea was never more than half true, and several prominent Nintendo employees disagreed with it. Shigeru Miyamoto, in particular, the most mechanically obsessed person involved with Mario, consistently opposed the notion that Sunshine was a huge departure from 64. He found it disappointing how little changed going from one to the other. Obviously, if you're interested in atmosphere and story, all of the 3D Mario games do have a different flavor, right up to the release of Super Mario Galaxy 2. But to many at Nintendo, this idea that story matters in a Mario game was also just another pretense, something that held Mario back by imposing unreasonable expectations. Super Mario 64 had been a game that told stories implicitly, through its level design, while Sunshine broke convention by filling its world with NPC dialogue and cutscenes. Then Galaxy made a valiant but probably doomed effort to reconcile these approaches by using the missions in each galaxy as a storytelling vehicle while keeping those stories small and ignorable. But in my opinion, the most pretentious 3D Mario game of them all was actually Super Mario Galaxy 2, not because it wasted a lot of time on story, but because so much of its content looks like it's telling a story without really saying anything. The storybook-style intro could easily be stripped from the game without affecting it in the slightest. All it tells you is that Mario found a Luma and Bowser kidnapped Peach, the kind of thing the new Super Mario Bros. Series would accomplish in 30 seconds with a non-interactive cutscene. Luigi shows up at some point, but he doesn't have anything to tell you except that you can play as him if you want. Lubba is ostensibly an important character without ever doing a single thing that couldn't be done by a generic Luma or Mario. Floating next to Mario and making a frowny face is treated with the same dramatic weight that the original Galaxy gave to Rosalina saving Mario's life, along with the entire galaxy in which he lives. Super Mario 3D Land dispenses with all of this posturing. Instead of a shallow attempt at dramatic storytelling, you get a 30-second cutscene that instantly tells you the stakes. Peach is kidnapped, Bowser's at large, so go kick his Bowsery butt. Tutorials aren't needed, because the first stage is the tutorial, just like how every Mario game worked before 1996. And the level hub, a concept that was barely innovated on since Super Mario 64 and had become downright laughable by Galaxy 2, is just thrown out. No more hubs, just do one stage at a time until you're done. It's even more restrictive than Super Mario Bros. 3, but hey, it worked for the original Super Mario Bros., right? For a game that's always in a huge rush, and for all I know had quite a rushed development, Super Mario 3D Land feels surprisingly complete. The designers knew what they wanted, and they didn't let past precedent or the bugbear of innovation stop them from doing what they knew was fun. If a concept worked in 2D but had never been tried in 3D before, they just went ahead and did it. And the vast majority of the time, they ended up with something that felt fresh, despite being cobbled together from old ideas. And while I might sometimes feel wistful for the ambitions that the Mario series jettisoned with this entry, I also find its insights for how to make a Mario game fun without any of that baggage quite refreshing. So, yeah, this section won't take long. Super Mario 3D Land did not add a single major character or story element to the series. Like the new Super Mario Bros. Games, it's far more conspicuous for how little story there is than for what its story actually is. If anything, I suppose it can be credited with the idea of the final battle with Bowser being more of a platforming gauntlet than a straight fight, although there are clear precedents for this in previous Mario games, including Sunshine. Plus, this is more of a gameplay development than a story one, even if it does affect the tone of the finale. Speaking of gameplay, you won't be surprised to hear that, as a game which pulls as many level elements as it can get away with from older Mario games, Super Mario 3D Land isn't a huge net contributor of gameplay ideas either. Most of its level gimmicks are a variation on earlier ideas, and its few wholly original concepts, like the tapering metal platforms that sink one level at a time into the lava in Bowser stages, weren't repeated in any later games. It did manage to get a few of its new enemies reused, however. The Goomba stack, a tower of Goombas that can be stomped flat all at once for a satisfying bonus, was brought back not only for 3D World, but also for Odyssey, where they're the key to getting a few hidden power moons. And the Bua-like Peepas found their way into New Super Mario Bros. 2, making them something more than a one-off variant of a classic enemy. None of Mario's moves in Super Mario 3D Land is completely new, but by nerfing the side jump and making you charge up to do a backflip, it does succeed in de-emphasizing vertical movement and giving more utility to rolling around and somersaulting, which stuck around all the way through to Super Mario Odyssey, a game where you roll so much that Sonic the Hedgehog would be jealous. And finally, in general design terms, Super Mario 3D Land's contribution to the series isn't necessarily specific choices that it made, but rather its attitude. With this game, the Tokyo team decided to let 2D and 3D Mario merge in a way that would previously have been considered a betrayal. Auto-scrolling stages, coin heavens, every boss just being a Bowser encounter. These are concepts that the series had left behind in the world of 2D for more than a decade. But Super Mario 3D Land went back and dusted them off, and in much the same vein as New Super Mario Bros., discovered that they still had a lot of life in them. You can see this as a bold experiment for 3D Mario, or a concession to the consistently higher sales of 2D Mario. But either way, this was the direction Nintendo would take going forward, at least until Super Mario Odyssey. And most importantly, from Nintendo's perspective, this change worked. Super Mario 3D Land was a commercial hit. It didn't sell as well as the new Super Mario Bros. Series, but it handily outsold all of the 3D Mario games except Galaxy, which it tied with. It was one of the first successful steps that Nintendo took to distance itself from the 3DS's troubled launch, and reassured fans and investors alike that Nintendo had a future in the portable market. But what was in store for that future? No one could say for certain, but a look into the recent past might have given them a clue. Super Mario Galaxy had been a hit, and the team had become so wrapped up in it that they eventually chose to defy tradition by making a straight sequel a few years later. Now, this new hybrid 2D-3D Mario game was a hit, and there was a precedent for making a sequel. It was time to make Super Mario 3D Land bigger and better. More levels, more polish, more spectacle. And the only place Nintendo was going to find all that was an entirely new world. A Super Mario 3D world.